Hello and welcome to the Not a Day for Soundbites podcast. I'm your host, as always, Will Barber-Taylor. In this episode, we will look back on a leader who has almost been forgotten, one who is nearly totally lost to the mists of time for many people, despite his significance. He was significant for two reasons. Firstly, he was the first Englishman to lead the Labour Party, and secondly, he led Labour during one of its most important election campaigns, the election of 1922. If things had gone differently, he could well have become Prime Minister. This episode looks back on a rare surviving speech given by J R Clynes, John Robert Clynes, and attempts to answer the question, well, who was he?
The Britain that is going to be forged in the white heat of this revolution will be no place for restrictive practices or for outdated methods on either side of industry.
Education, education, and education.
You start with far-fetched resolution. They are then pickled into a rigid dogma called. And you go through the years sticking to that. Outdated, misplaced, irrelevant to the real need.
We've changed the world before, and we're going to change the world again.
Before we tackle the speech, to which I have to give thanks to Harry Taylor for providing a copy of, I'd like to talk about Clynes' life. As I just mentioned, he's often forgotten, and like many early Labour figures whose name isn't Ramsay or Keir, his lack of remembrance is quite frustrating because he lived at the very beginning of the Labour Party's existence. He served as leader of the Labour Party. He was the inaugural holder of the deputy leadership of the Labour Party, and he was one of the first Labour Home Secretaries. Clynes, despite this, has sunk into obscurity. You will not hear many people remark that they are admirers of or have even heard of John Robert Clynes. And this is a shame because his background and his career, as well as his ability as an orator, should be remembered in the same way that Hardy and MacDonald and other people who were significant in the early period of the Labour Party, like Philip Snowden, for example, he should be remembered in the same way that they are. Clynes was born in Oldham, in Lancashire, in 1869, the son of Irish immigrants. Like many people who lived near to Manchester at the time, my own family included, England represented a possibility of a better life than that they had found in Ireland, that they had endured. Clynes, as I will go on to discuss in the rest of the episode, was very much formed by his Irishness. He would, in his autobiography, mention the Manchester Martyrs, three men who were accused of the murder of a police sergeant in the 1870s and executed as a result. And that sense of being both English and Irish was crucial to Clynes and important for understanding who he was as a politician and why he wanted to change things. And despite the desire for a better life, and despite the best efforts of the Irish community in contributing to the building of industrial Britain through their labour, and through their ingenuity and through their strength of character, they often found that they were forced to live in appalling living conditions and endure vile bigotry. The kind of bigotry that is most common with the signs that I think we all know were placed on boarding houses during the period. And also, in terms of the living conditions, one example, not in Oldham, but in Ancoats from my own family. At some points during the Victorian period, the streets of Ancoats were pretty much literally filled with sewage. And it's in this world, in this community, that Clynes really developed his sense of politics and his desire for change. Clynes' father, Patrick, arrived in England sometime in or around about 1851. We don't have a precise date for when he came to Ireland, but he certainly came in that year or perhaps a little bit earlier. And he was one of the many immigrants who travelled from Ireland to England in the wake of not only the Irish potato famine of 1845 to 1852, but also because of, as Clynes mentions, Acts of Parliament which had negative effects on Irish people. Clynes refers to his father in his autobiography having been evicted from his land, and that the reason he specifically went to not just England but to Lancashire in particular was because he had been attracted by the prosperity of the Lancashire cotton industry, which of course was booming during this period and had been very much involved in politics in its own way because of the American Civil War, would be involved in politics with the American Civil War. However, unlike Clynes, Patrick did not spend a long time in the mills because he believed that the situation was far too precarious, and he became employed by Oldham Municipal Council, as a labourer. At one point he was in fact a gravedigger, something which must have certainly brought home the precarious nature of life during this period and the very thin line between life and death. Clynes' father's work as a labourer meant that he could provide a solid working class upbringing for his son in Lancashire. And Clynes received a certain amount of education because he necessarily would need to at St Anne's School, but it was nothing near the kind of levels of basic state education that we get in Britain today. Clynes went to work at the age of 10, part-time. He was also part-time in school, and he was working as a piercer in the Dowry cotton mill. The Dowry mill was one of the newer mills in the town relative to some of the more established mills. It was a minor mill compared to the mills operated by the Platt brothers, who were Oldham's leading employers. They were responsible for about 42% of the jobs in Oldham by the 1890s, by the time Clynes had left the cotton mills. But what's interesting about the Platt brothers, and what's interesting about the cotton industry in Lancashire and in Oldham in particular, is its association with liberal politics and with radical politics. The Platt brothers contributed to not only Oldham's economy but also its politics. James and John Platt both served as MPs for Oldham during the 1850s, 60s and 70s, and of course, infamously, James Platt was sadly killed by his cousin James Radcliffe in the wake of his election in the 1850s, something that would certainly have put a dampeners on the family's connection with politics, you might think, but instead his older brother very much embraced the role of Member of Parliament when he was eventually elected after James had died. And it was when Clynes had reached the age of 17 after he'd been working part-time in the mills for 7 years, full-time since the age of 12, that, as his biographer Henry George records, he saw an old second-hand dictionary. Now, despite the financial strain that the family was under, the lack of resources that they would have had, Clynes wanted that dictionary. He saved up for 2 weeks of his pocket money, which was essentially the money that he was given back from his own wages. The majority of the wages would go to providing for the family, but he would have received a certain small allowance from that. And eventually Clynes was able to buy the dictionary. He would spend hours poring over it when he didn't have any work to do, very much the early hours, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. And he said to his biographer, George, "The bigger the words, the more I loved them, and the oftener I wrote them out. I loved their sound, and as I copied them out, I said over each syllable aloud as the book gave it. I loved long words merely for the pretty flow of them, and because I loved them. I wanted to make quite sure of their why and wherefore, so the longer they were, the more often I copied them out in my slow, crab-like hand. And each time the roll and the rush of their syllables ate more surely into my brain. I'm not quite sure whether I am proud or sorry to have been such a word worshipper." And this initial encounter with a dictionary gave Clynes a voracious desire for knowledge and a love of literature. As he grew older, his literary taste began to broaden, and he began to read the works of Mill, Carlyle, Ruskin, parting thanks to the second-hand bookshops in Oldham and parting thanks to the library in Oldham. The wonders that he found in the works that he read opened a new and exciting world to him, one that seemed to speak of ideals and ideas that weren't being enacted by the politicians in Oldham and in the rest of the country. Oldham itself was, at this time, a constituency that had a strong progressive radical streak to it. It was one that, however, was often tempered by the fact that the progressive, liberal-minded folk of the town often benefited from what Blake so famously described as the dark satanic mills, the same mills that were part home to Clynes and his contemporaries. And the reason that Oldham was like this, and the reason that parts of Lancashire were like this at the time, was in part due to religious reasons. There was obviously sizable Catholic populations, Irish Catholics coming over. There were obviously deeper recusant tendencies in Lancashire as a whole that went back to prior to the Reformation and had been carried on, hadn't been completely extinguished despite the best efforts of the state. There were also strong Presbyterian, Methodist, Wesleyan populations in Oldham and in Lancashire at large. So the marginalisation of these groups often led them towards politics that wasn't conservative, that was radical, that was progressive, that wanted them to be able to go to university, that wanted them to be able to... Of course, they were able to go to university at this point, but over time it had been a result of a great radical push from areas in Oldham and Lancashire more broadly to the rest of the country. So this is important to understand in the context of Clynes. Clynes was not operating in an environment that was bereft of any proto-Labour politics. Oldham, Manchester, Middleton, Lancaster, Lancashire had very strong progressive and radical elements that, when the Liberal Party began to fail, would certainly seek a new venue, and in some small part had already through splinter factions to the Liberal Party. And because he wasn't living in a vacuum, Clynes was able to engage with people of a similar political disposition to himself. He spent the small amount of money that he had on 2 weekly night schools with a former schoolmaster, and became, because of his background, because of his sense of Irish identity, entangled in the cause of Irish independence. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Oldham's Irish population contained many people who were engaged in the cause of Irish freedom, a freedom that they felt that the Liberal Party, who were too divided on the issue, weren't willing to do anything about. One of the great fractures that occurred in the Liberals during the late 19th and early 20th century would be Irish Home Rule. Ireland having not just its own parliament, but also a kind of dominion status, something that would evolve during the latter 19th century and into the early 20th century as a concept of a way to make certain parts of the British Empire feel not totally like they were colonies, but they had a certain amount of autonomy. Canada being one of the prime examples of a dominion country. But of course, the way that Irish independence, Irish freedom was handled by the Liberals meant that many people, particularly on the more radical wing, wanted to go to organisations like the Irish Land League, which had arisen thanks to the quite often brutal landlordism that the English had visited on Irish tenants, and also the Irish National League, which Clynes became involved in. And it would be at a meeting of the Irish National League that Clynes would really feel he had a voice and would properly engage in debate. He engaged in a very spirited debate with a young man who, like many of the street speakers of his age, was famous in his area at the time, but hasn't left too much of a trace. A young man called Burns. Clynes refers to him as M. Burns, potentially Mark or Michael Burns, but I haven't been able to find any solid evidence of him. Anyway, Clynes got into a debate with this young man called Burns, and he bested him. And because of that, Burns was able to encourage Clynes, and he gave him a sense of confidence and a fast friendship that would help Clynes develop as a politician and would give him a greater sense that he didn't just have to be a piercer, he didn't just have to work in the factories of Oldham, he could find something new. And this newfound confidence and this encouragement from Burns led to Clynes beginning to pen a series of letters to local newspapers decrying the conditions most factory workers, in particular those working in cotton factories, faced. And he was very passionate in the letters, he was very forthright, but he also realised that if he sent the letters and they were published, that he couldn't do so under his own name, because he would soon be sacked, he'd soon be unemployed. So Clynes chose the pseudonym of Piercer to sign off his letters, the Piercer, or a Piercer, but generally Piercer. They became increasingly popular with people who were reading the newspapers, and indeed with the publishers themselves, and as such Clynes began to spend more of his free time composing the letters in order that they had the best literary value that he thought that they needed. And in one particular letter, he made clear where his politics was going towards, where it was drifting towards. A movement of workers, a labour movement. And in the letter he wrote, "We scarcely know what might now the position of the ordinary worker, were it not for the increasing exertions of our growing trade unions, be. But the times have changed, and the old weapons will not do for the new battles. If the workers want different laws, the workers also want different lawmakers. Some say the workers must make the adoption of their programme to the point on which future elections might turn. But instead of forcing others to adopt their programme, it would be better for the workers to elect their own members to carry their programme out." Clynes' writing and his somewhat unsuccessful attempt, he was the only one who actually participated in it, to organise a strike in his own mill, emboldened him to seek out more people to be engaged with, and in fact to form a specific union for piercers. There were of course other unions that existed that partly represented piercers, but there was no specific piercers union. That changed in 1886 when, at a meeting in Bolton, Clynes, alongside other piercers, formed the Piercers Union. And the Piercers Union would occupy most of Clynes' free time, and he began to become popular with giving speaking engagements, and it would be during these speaking engagements his identity as the piercer or piercer had become public knowledge at this point, whether through Burns maybe telling people that it had been Clynes who had written the letters, or maybe Clynes himself had said. It's not explicitly clear, but his growing influence and his growing stardom brought him into contact with Will Thorne, who was similarly one of the great early rising stars of the trade union movement at the time. Thorne had recently, when he met Clynes, helped form the National Union of Gas Workers and General Labourers, and was so impressed with Clynes that he invited him to join as the union's Lancashire organiser. Now, this would have been a massive step for Clynes, going from working as he did in the cotton factory as a piercer in the mill, working in the mill, to becoming a full-time organiser. It would have meant an increase in pay, and it would also have meant that he would have been able to speak much more readily than he previously would have been, for fear of becoming unemployed if he had been too explicit, and as such he readily accepted, and soon began advocating not just in Lancashire, but across the rest of the country as well. Clynes' travels allowed him to be present in 1893 in Bradford for the formation of a brand new political party, one which, in its own way, would cause a sea change in British politics, the Independent Labour Party. Clynes' enthusiasm for Labour soon caught the eye of the movement's most important elected official, Keir Hardie. Having won election in West Ham South the previous year, Hardie was distinct in that he was not merely a trade union liberal, but something different. He wasn't a lib-lab MP as had existed in previous decades when trade unionists would stand for the Liberal Party under the slogan, under the category of liberal Labour MPs. He wasn't like that. He was different. He was the embodiment of a new political movement that understood the need for radical change to come to Britain as soon as possible. Clynes recognised this in Hardie and became a keen admirer of him. As the Labour Party grew, he soon too became more involved with it, with the formation of the Labour Representative Committee, the official name given to candidates standing to become Labour MPs. Now, the LRC was distinct at the time from the Independent Labour Party, to which most Labour members belonged. The parliamentary party and the membership would not become truly united under one umbrella until the 1920s. So, if you wanted to be a member of the Labour Party and an activist, you were usually a member of the Independent Labour Party. If you were an MP, you were a member of the Labour Representative Committee, or as it later became the Labour Party in Parliament. But you could, as in the case of, for example, Hardie and MacDonald, be members of both, but generally that was a very limited number of people because, of course, the lack of Labour MPs at the time was not as it would go on to be. Clynes was elected to sit on its executive as one of the trade union representatives, and it's important to realise this just shows how prominent he was becoming and how influential he was in Labour politics, to think that having gone from being a young boy, working in a cotton mill, writing certain letters which had a regional readership but not a national readership, and then growing through the trade union movement to become a figure on the LRC was greatly important for Clynes' future and for his ability to influence the Labour Party to play a role in it, because he was there really at the very beginning. Unfortunately, the 1900 election, which was the first one that the LRC was able to contest, wouldn't prove to be a breakthrough for it, and it may have been to Clynes' benefit that he was not included amongst the number of failed Labour candidates in that election. He spent the next few years continuing to hone his craft as a speaker and a writer, travelling across Britain to extol trade unionism and socialism to anyone who would hear it. He was proposed as a magistrate in Oldham in 1904, which was part of a move then to get more Labour supporters into positions like that. One of the most important and early ways that early Labour politicians were able to gain power were through things like being elected magistrates, were through school governorships, county councils, local councils, and it would be through these means that the Labour Party really gained its early successes, both as the Independent Labour Party and later as the Labour Representative Committee. He was also nearly persuaded to stand in a by-election in the same year, but he decided against it. But it seems that despite the fact that he was becoming more and more prominent, there was a hesitancy about him, a modesty or a shyness that made him not fully commit to standing as a potential Labour MP, despite the Labour Party making gains in the by-elections between 1900 and 1906. But by 1906, he seems to have gotten over that shyness, that reluctance. What exactly was responsible for this growing confidence? It's perhaps simply that Clynes felt more at ease with himself and more at ease with his position in the Labour Party, because although he turned down potentially becoming an MP in 1904, he accepted the challenge of representing the Labour Party in Manchester North East, as the constituency was then called, in the 1906 election. Now, what's interesting about this seat is it wasn't like Oldham. It wasn't like some of the other seats which were liberal-leaning. It was a staunchly Conservative seat, and it had been staunchly Conservative since the 1880s. When Clynes stood, he was the first Labour candidate to stand in over a decade, the previous candidate being James Johnston, who had won just over 500 votes, and he came a distant third to the Conservative and Liberal candidates. However, Clynes would succeed in this seat, in part, not just to do with the changing in circumstances and his own abilities, but also because he benefited, as many Labour candidates did in 1906, from the McDonnell-Gladstone Pact. And it's important to consider that this pact is one of the most important political decisions that any political party, the Liberal Party in particular, made. It was a pact between Ramsay MacDonald and Herbert Gladstone, the son of the former British Prime Minister William Gladstone, and Herbert was then Chief Whip of the Liberal Party. The idea of the pact was that Liberals would not field candidates in seats in which Labour could beat the Conservatives, as long as Labour didn't split the vote in seats in which the Liberals thought that they could beat the Conservatives and take the seat back. It wasn't quite exactly like that. There were certain seats in which Liberal candidates did stand, but they weren't given a great deal of support, so the Labour candidate was able to overcome them, and similarly there were some non-affiliated Labour Socialist candidates who did stand in other seats. So it wasn't quite a fully formalised pact. It wasn't explicitly set out, because obviously it was meant to be something of a secret. But it was, in all but name, one of the most successful, particularly from the Labour Party's point of view, political pacts that existed in the early 20th century. And because of the pact, and because of changes in circumstances in trade union law, and in a growing confidence of Labour candidates and a growing recognition of them, the Labour Party would win 29 seats in 1906. And it helped to give the Liberals a hefty majority. Clynes' new status as an MP, as one of that 29 who were elected, is one that was not only a great achievement, but also something of a handicap for him. The reason that it was a handicap for him is that during this period, MPs received no salary, and this meant it was incredibly difficult for those early Labour MPs to provide as much attention as possible to their constituency as they could, because they also had to try, and in a lot of cases, keep other jobs down to ensure that they had some money. The party itself could only give limited support to Clynes and the other new MPs, and he was effectively forced to continue working for the National Union of Gas Workers and General Labourers, as well as representing Manchester North East in Parliament, a very tricky situation for anyone who wanted to put all of their efforts into politics. Similarly, the still very Victorian, stuffy, formalised methods of the House of Commons did not inspire confidence amongst its new members. As Clynes recalled in his autobiography, the long, regal-sounding phrases from the chair, the formalities imposed on members, the tortuous indirectness surviving from more leisured days, the hours kept by the House, and its measured methods of business all seemed to us to be deliberately designed to stifle our enthusiasm and smother our anxious efforts. The stuffy nature of the House of Commons would become lessened by the inclusion of the 29 Labour MPs, and Clynes soon got used to balancing work for his constituents and for his union, a balancing act that must have placed a strain both on him and his family. Yet he proved to be more resourceful and hardy than had perhaps initially been expected of the young cotton mill worker who had begun writing to the newspapers, taking a leading role in Labour's response to the introduction of old age pensions and continuing to represent the interests of his constituents whilst also working for his union. Clynes was, it must be said, different in his attitude to a lot of socialists and social democratic activist in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. For one thing, he saw from an early age that change would only come through elected representation. Not all radical, progressive socialists, etc., whatever labels you want to use for them, thought that this was the right solution. Many of them thought that Parliament was merely a hindrance to social change, and they thought that they needed to do away with the parliamentary system in order that they could enact change. But of course, Clynes was proved right. They were proved wrong. Social change would come through Parliament. Labour would succeed through parliamentary means. But it wasn't only that distinguished Clynes from his colleagues, from his contemporaries. His attitude to the First World War also distinguished him, because he was in direct opposition to the likes of Keir Hardie and Ramsay MacDonald, who, for them, saw the First World War as in no way different from the imperialist wars of the past. MacDonald, who had stood against Britain's war with the Boers, in fact had lost when he was standing for an election initially. He'd lost his chance of becoming an MP because of his opposition to the Boer War. He, of course, was hardly likely to agree to a fight between major imperial powers on the continent of Europe, instigated, of course, by the assassination of an aristocrat. He saw this war as no different from any other British imperial adventure, but Clynes disagreed. He argued that supporting Britain's war effort was important because we had now to resist or else to surrender. We had either to repel an attack or submit to forces which would eventually have repressed the right of peaceful progressive throughout Europe. Now, whether that is something that can be fully agreed on is, of course, a matter for debate. Was war inevitable? Should Britain have become involved in it? There are clear arguments on both sides as to whether Labour should have become involved, whether it shouldn't have been become involved, whether Britain should have become involved, what the Labour Party's position, all these different things. However, what is clear is that Clynes' focus was on the best way to deal with the war, the best way to deal with it in a way that he felt showed Labour to be on the side of the people and of the country rather than in opposition to it. And as such, because of this, because MacDonald would resign in protest of the chairmanship of the Labour Party, Clynes would eventually become one of the very first Labour MPs to ever become a minister, as a minister of the national government, the coalition government, the war government, like Arthur Henderson, who became a Labour leader after MacDonald. And Henderson would gain his position in the government whilst H.H. Asquith was Prime Minister. However, Clynes would have to wait a couple of years until he became a member of the government, until 1917 when Lloyd George became Prime Minister. And part of the reason that he became a member of the government is because he was on a select committee related to food, and so he was chosen as the parliamentary private secretary to the Minister of Food, and eventually, later on, he became the Minister for Food himself. And because of his interest in this, he'd raised the matter at the Labour Party's conference only a year before. He was on the, as I just mentioned, the Select Committee. He knew what the problem was, and he wanted to act in a way that could provide a genuine solution rather than simply sniping, as he saw it, from the sidelines. And of course, the great question was how to feed Britain when Germany were using its U-boats to sink food carried into Britain from abroad, from Europe. Clynes' solution was that Britain should avoid German ships by buying food direct from the United States. And he was partly involved as Parliamentary Private Secretary and then, of course, as Minister for Food, for procuring this food. And one of the most extraordinary deals was struck in 1917 when the British government paid £200 million for ham and meat to be brought over from the US to Britain. Today, that would be equal to about £109 billion worth of meat and ham. The vast expense was, of course, ultimately necessary and ensured that Britain was saved from starvation, but to be involved in such monumental sums certainly must have put it into perspective for Clynes, the full scope and scale of power that government could have, and government that involved a Labour minister, and of course Clynes would hope eventually would be fully containing Labour ministers. A year later, as the war came to its end, Clynes would be promoted from the Principal Private Secretary to the Minister for Food in 1918. His promotion must have seemed extraordinary to the boy who had felt nervous about sending his letter about working conditions in Oldham cotton mills into the local newspaper. It was similar to when later on Ramsay MacDonald would become Prime Minister. A feat that would not have been expected of someone from a solidly working class background a few decades before. It was an incredible feat that the early members of the Labour Party managed to achieve. And Clynes would remain in government till just after the 1918 general election, returning fully to opposition when Lloyd George's national government were returned with a thumping majority, despite the implicit need for a government of such fading into the background as the war did. And Clynes managed to survive, of course, because he was still technically a member of the government. He had the coalition coupon. Most Labour MPs didn't have the coalition coupon, and so they lost their elections, but Clynes didn't, because he had been a member of the government and remained a member of the government until just after the election. The chaos of the Great War, as it would come to be known, would be replicated in the political upsets that beset Britain during the Roaring Twenties, of which Clynes would take a highly active role. The 1920s represented a sea change in British politics for the Labour Party in particular, but in British politics in general. The 1922 election saw Labour, led by Clynes, who had become leader only a year before, effectively supplanting the Liberals, gaining 85 seats and making them the second largest party in the Commons after the Conservative government of Bonar Law. Clynes' leadership was much like the rest of his career, done in a modest, practical style. He was in his own way an artful speaker, and certainly a man who knew how to keep the Labour Party together. He was also someone who could be willing to take risks, such as joining the government during the First World War, when many other members of his party balked at the idea and thought it was ridiculous. Yet he was not one for great political flair. He wasn't Ramsay MacDonald, he wasn't Keir Hardie. He was much more in the Attlee mould of a quiet professional, not a great dramatic political figure. And it's perhaps for this reason that MacDonald was able to challenge Clynes for the leadership of the Labour Party. MacDonald felt that Clynes did not have the instinctive political tactical brain that he had, and that Clynes was not somebody who would be able to command the world stage in the way MacDonald felt he could. Certainly, MacDonald's role in the creation of the Labour Party and being instrumental in its initial success meant that he had a certain degree of support in the parliamentary party. However, even though MacDonald would win, the result was fairly tight, with MacDonald winning 52.1% of Labour MPs to Clynes' 47.9%. A difference of 5 MPs voting in all. And it's worth remembering as well that had the Labour Party not been voting just as a parliamentary party, whether it had been voting in the way that the Labour Party elects its leaders now, the result may have been different. MacDonald may have won by a more significant margin, or Clynes may have remained leader for longer. And it's a fascinating thing to think as to how, when you look at the Labour Party now, and when you look at all political parties, how intertwined the membership is with the parliamentary party. And yet, going back just over 100 years, that was not the case. There was a very clear division between the parliamentary party and the membership. They weren't even technically, until a little after this period, members of the exact same party as such. The parliamentary party and the Independent Labour Party, for which most Labour activists were actually members, were separate. And it's something that I think reveals the massive ways in which politics have changed, and which, even for people who were outsiders like MacDonald, Hardy and Clynes, there was still a sense of division and perhaps a sense almost of, not quite elitism, but a clear need to separate the MPs from the members, which of course is not something that you can really consider now in the climate of the Labour Party and the climate of other political parties. And perhaps because of realising that Clynes did have that popularity, and that had it gone, 5 votes the other way, Clynes would have remained leader, MacDonald understood that he didn't want to upset a potential rival, and he didn't want him on the outside, so he effectively created the position of Deputy Leader of the Labour Party specifically for Clynes, so that Clynes would have it not as a lack of respect from MacDonald, that he would not just be cast into the wilderness, he would be Deputy Leader of the party, and Clynes would remain in that position for 10 years. He would outlast MacDonald in terms of leadership, and it was a position that he was instrumental in understanding how it should be linked to the leadership, what its role should be in relation to the leadership, and how it should be defined against the leadership. Defined not just as a lackey of the leader of the Labour Party, but a role that had its own mandate in a way, and had its own sense of place within the wider Labour movement in terms of importance. And by the time that the speech that we're going to be discussing in a moment was given, by a few years later, the 1929 election, he had been Deputy Leader, Clynes had been Deputy Leader for a number of years. He'd served in MacDonald's brief 1924 administration as Lord Privy Seal, and the MacDonald administration is interesting in that, similar to those early Labour MPs, those early 29 Labour MPs who were elected in 1906, it came in part as a result of a liberal short-sightedness. Despite reuniting his party, winning over 100 seats, H. Asquith was so arrogant in his assumption that Ramsay MacDonald and the rest of the Labour Party would not be able to form any kind of government, that they would just immediately fall. Eventually the government did fall, but not after giving it a very good go of it, and more to do with a lack of a parliamentary majority than anything else. Asquith thought that, let Labour in for a brief time and they'll mess it up, and there will be a liberal resurgence and the Labour Party will be effectively killed. That wasn't what happened. The public saw that there was a real alternative to the Conservatives that wasn't the Liberal Party. Between them, Asquith and Herbert Gladstone effectively signed the Liberal Party's own death warrant because of their own short-sightedness, their own arrogance, that, oh no, it's all right, we can benefit from letting the Labour Party have a bit of power, or letting them have a few seats, not realising that giving that opportunity for Labour to get its foot on the ladder meant that suddenly vast swathes of the British public thought, well, hang on, we don't need to continue to support the Liberals, let's vote Labour. And because of this, the 1924 Labour government was something that could be reflected on by Labour MPs canvassing in the 1929 election, and it was seen as a potential differentiator from the Conservative government in 1929. The economy was already in free fall in Britain. The Conservatives under Stanley Baldwin, the great survivor of the 1920s and 1930s, in many ways one of the most successful politicians of those 2 decades, seemed at this point tired and uninspiring, and the Labour Party was making itself as ready for government as possible, and wanting to make itself as clearly ready to reassume the mantle of government as it possibly could be. And the speech that we're about to hear clips from was given by Clynes during the 1929 election. Thanks once again to Harry Taylor for providing a recording of his speech. Before we hear sections of the speech, I should warn you that this is copied from a gramophone recording, so it isn't the best quality, but it's hopefully still informative of Clynes' speaking style and the kind of speeches that he was making during the 1929 election. So he begins by arguing that unemployment can be dealt with.
Periods of acute unemployment have recurred for generations of time. Many other evils, social and physical, have confronted mankind. But these evils have been resisted and have been greatly reduced. Unemployment, when endured in such distressing degree as we know it today, can be attacked and overcome.
In this section of the speech, the clip you've just heard, Clynes is focusing on the biggest threat of the day, unemployment. His own father's experience of precarious unemployment when arriving in England, initially working in the cotton mills, must have weighed on his mind when he was giving this speech, because it was something that was clearly very close to his heart. He goes on to argue that Labour's position on unemployment has been the same for decades, and that Labour are greatly concerned about the right to work.
It is something new for this to be said by other political parties. But for the Labour Party to say this is quite commonplace and old. For 40 years we have pleaded for the right to work, and we have implored the country to regard useful or productive service as an obligation which none should escape.
Clynes highlights here that Labour had a track record of discussing and focusing on unemployment, something that the other major parties didn't. With the working man seemingly under attack in 1929, Clynes is able to position the Labour Party as the only party that would look after working people, looking after working men, and it was an important message to get across as clearly as possible. You know, times were hard, but vote for the party you know understands the issue of unemployment, wants to change it, has been going on about it for decades, unlike its opponents. Clynes expands by attacking those who he believes refuse to work.
Those who do not work live upon the labour of those who do, and great groups of idlers not only impose upon other people the burden of providing a living for them, but they involve many other losses in reduced efficiency and character, and they become generally a social danger.
And I think what's fascinating about this section of the speech is it demonstrates that the Labour Party during this election saw itself representing explicitly the workers, and those who were judged in some way to be bone idle were not to be supported in the same way. They were seen as dead weights. They had to be effectively helped into the workforce. And it's an argument that might sound somewhat conservative, or indeed not within the spectrum of the Labour Party's values, as some judge them to be, but it's clear that Clynes thought it was important, and it was important to focus on work and workers, the workers who he felt had been neglected and needed support. He moves on to using the comparison between work during wartime and work during peacetime.
During a war period, work is found for all. Every energy is expended to resist aggression and to ensure a victory. That energy is expended to destroy. Now we believe that in times of peace, men who cannot find an employer should be made by the nation, secure for service, and by their work, create wealth, which would be a blessing to their country. That wealth would be in place of the crushing charges amounting to more than £1 million a week now being paid to keep our unemployed alive, doing nothing. To those who ask how can we afford to find work, we answer that we cannot any longer afford not to find it. The greatest waste is in idleness, and wealth accrues only from the work of hand and brain.
His language, again here, is fascinating. He talks of work as a patriotic duty, that it is better to find work for the unemployed to create productivity than it is to pay for their maintenance. Clynes' argument is one reflective of the great worry that clearly preoccupied the minds of all who would have heard his speech. That the country needed to tackle unemployment as it would during a wartime. The war, after all, had ended only just over a decade beforehand, one of the most cataclysmic wars that had ever been fought, that Britain had ever been involved in, and Britain could not stand idly by and not do something urgent to force economic growth in whatever way was needed. Clynes then moves on to setting out what Labour believed in.
The Labour Party is convinced that productive service can be organised in order to absorb the greater part of the unemployed, who, being changed from burdensome idlers into wage earners and wage spenders, would thereby make a demand for the work of many others.
Clynes' argument that Labour wants to focus on getting the unemployed into work and to not only become wage earners but also wage spenders shows an approach to economic management that is focused, not as MacDonald's national government that succeeded his second Labour administration would be on cuts. He's not talking about cuts, but on growth through expansion and investment. Clynes' reference to the scorn Labour bills put forward and his reference to the need for a Labour majority is crucial in understanding the appeal of the Labour Party at the 1929 election. Rather than it representing a party that, like both the Liberals and the Conservatives, had been on and off in power for decades, Labour was truly a new force that seemed ready to govern and ready to get the economy moving. And it's at this point that Clynes then references the policies of the previous Labour government, the 1924 government.
The Labour Party would deal effectively with these problems if given a mandate for its plans. Its plans have in detail often been put before Parliament in bills and resolutions, and have been scornfully rejected by men who are now being driven to adopt them. During the few months of 1924, when Labour had office without power, its policies substantially lessened the number of the unemployed, while wages rose and exports increased. Everything would be done by a Labour government to secure the overseas markets, which we must have, and we would use to the full our great internal resources in order that hundreds of thousands of ready and willing men and women, now doomed to idleness, should be usefully employed.
Clynes cleverly makes 2 points here. He promotes Labour's record in government, but also goes to great pains to point out that Labour did not have a majority, effectively, subtly saying to the listener, this is what Labour did when it didn't even have a majority. Vote for us and give us that majority and see what we will be able to achieve. Give Labour another chance, give us a chance where we have a proper majority, we'll be able to do far more than even the great things that we were able to do as a minority government. Clynes then ends his speech by remarking on how solving unemployment will mean that many other issues can also be solved.
The solution of many other questions waits upon the settlement of this one, and it would pay the country to pay wages in exchange for the material and moral wealth produced by employment, and put an end to the scandal of giving millions of pounds for nothing whatever.
Clynes' speech is a fine example of the kind of language and arguments that were being used by Labour during this period. It is also perhaps reflective of the man that this speech is not in any way dramatic or uses any real emotive language. He sets out in fairly straightforward and simple terms the issues and the solutions as he sees them. This is perhaps why Clynes has so often been overlooked in the canon of major Labour Party figures. He doesn't have the same kind of dramatic flair for self-promotion that others have, and having lost the leadership to MacDonald, he was ultimately overshadowed by him. After Labour's election in 1929, Clynes became Home Secretary. One famous act that he's associated with is his refusal to give Trotsky, who was hiding out in Turkey, a visa to enter the United Kingdom to give a lecture, and Trotsky was perhaps understandably rather upset and wrote this of Clynes in his autobiography. The pious Mr. Clynes ought at least to have known that democracy, in a sense, inherited the right of asylum from the Christian Church, which, in turn, inherited it, with much besides, from paganism. It was enough for a pursued criminal to make his way into a temple, sometimes enough even to touch only the ring of the door to be safe from persecution. Thus the Church understood the right of asylum as the right of the persecuted to asylum, and not as an arbitrary exercise of will on the part of pagan or Christian priests. Whilst his decision to refuse entry to Trotsky has been recorded in the history books and obviously mentioned in Trotsky's own autobiography, Clynes was involved in far more interesting acts as Home Secretary, which have been sadly overlooked. He became greatly engaged in prison reform, wanting to reduce recidivists. He similarly became engaged in attempting to reform the cotton industry, and perhaps most unusually, at least from our own perspective, he was involved in efforts to create an alternative voting system, something that in the 1920s gained a great deal of traction. Clynes had been vice president of the Proportional Representation Society, what's now the Electoral Reform Society, and he thought about introducing electoral reform, attempted to introduce it in one way or another, but was curtailed both by Parliament as a whole and by his own party. Certainly Ramsay MacDonald was not jumping for joy at the thought of proportional representation, particularly now that Labour had actually managed to win an election outright and had its own majority. He didn't want that to be reduced by any kind of proportional representation. Clynes' time as Home Secretary would ultimately be brief, because in 1931 he resigned, along with most of the cabinet, at MacDonald's decision to bring about cuts to public spending in the wake of the 1929 Wall Street crash. Clynes would, like most Labour MPs, lose his seat at the 1931 election, though he regained it 4 years later during the 1935 election. He would remain as an MP until 1945 and would see Labour's great landslide victory led by Clement Attlee. It must have been somewhat bittersweet to see such a victory and know he could play no active role in it. Despite all his efforts on the part of the poor, when Clynes died 4 years later, in 1949, at the age of 80, he did so without any great estate to support him, and he didn't really have any great support. Bizarrely enough, his union pension meant that he wasn't given relief from the House of Commons. He wasn't entitled to any sort of pension, so money had to be raised from the Labour Party ranks and for those who knew him to give him some kind of financial support. He was soon forgotten by the Labour Party, sadly, despite his best efforts for it. Whilst Keir Hardie is well remembered, and there are still a fair few people who know the name of Ramsay MacDonald, both for positive and negative reasons, sadly, the name of John Robert Clynes has practically faded into the endless tides of history. It's worth ending this episode by reflecting on what James Joseph Mallon, later Warden of Toynbee Hall, said of Clynes. All his life, he has been battling with prejudice, reasoning with it, dispelling it and routing it, transmuting it as often as is not into cordiality and goodwill. He stands above all other Labour men as an agent of understanding and reconciliation. This seems a fitting epitaph to end this episode on a man who went from working as a child labourer to within a whisper of becoming Prime Minister. If you've enjoyed this episode, I hope you'll listen to the next one. Thank you.